What if your passion for wine could turn into a thriving business and podcast? Today, I'm sitting down with Hailey from Cork Fizz. She took her love for wine and turned it into a business that educates, entertains, and builds community. So, whether you're a wine lover or a podcaster looking for creative ways to grow your brand, this episode is packed with insights. So, grab your glass and let's dive in. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Hailey Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hey, Hailey, thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I am so excited for our conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yes, and so you're my first other Hailey on the show, and I just love it. I love it. We spell our names very differently, but we both have similar passions, wine and podcasting, so we might be the same person. I don't know.
I love it. No, I love it. I think it is funny. Hailey, I feel like, was not a popular name my mom said when I was born, and now, I know so many Haileys my age. It must have just been, the name of the time.
I guess so. No, well, I love that. And, since we are in the Podcast Cafe, I have an important question for you. What is your go-to coffee order?
Oh, okay. So some people might think it's crazy. I don't actually like coffee. I have never been a fan of, it's both the taste and my digestive system does not like coffee.
Yeah.
So I've never gotten into it. So instead my go-to is usually a matcha latte. So I'll go either a matcha with, and it has to have some kind of syrup. I can't handle the pure green taste of it.
Yes. Yeah. No,
so it
I
needs
agree.
to have something sweet. So if they have a lavender or vanilla syrup, I'll do a matcha lavender vanilla syrup and oat milk because I am lactose intolerant.
Yum, I love that. And, maybe a better fitting question is, let's say this is a cafe that serves wine, like Retreat, where we got drinks one time. What's your go-to cafe wine kind of drink?
Oh gosh, that's hard. I mean, I think a lot of times it depends on the cafe. I think if they have a cool wine list and lots of fun options, I'm going to go for something unique or different that I haven't tasted before. If it's one where it's just kind of your typical grocery store, wines that aren't as exciting, probably a sparkling wine because I feel like that's just a good go-to.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, I'd love to hear more about your background and your podcast.
Yeah, sure. So my podcast is called the Cork Fizz Guide to Wine. It's all about the world of wine, educating on wine, and interviewing people in the wine world. And my goal is to make the world of wine approachable. And that's pretty much been my goal throughout all of my business. I started Cork Fizz during the pandemic. It started with virtual tastings. Just kind of the idea was we have to do these Zoom happy hours. This is the only exciting thing we can do right now. So I want to try to make it even more fun and do something a little different. So, the Cork Fizz virtual tasting got started. And then, from there, I did a lot of different things. And I knew I'd always wanted to start a podcast. It was very overwhelming about thinking about starting it. But once I decided to do it, it was a very exciting adventure. And I've noticed that the talking part comes naturally. That has been good. It's just all the other parts of figuring out, how do you market a podcast? Somebody asked me, how do you grow podcasts? I'm I don't know. I just kind of keep doing the talking thing and keep sharing it with more people, and do what I love and hope that hope it connects with people.
Yeah. And I mean, you have such a cool niche. When did your love for wine start?
It started, gosh, I can't remember the year, but it was after a trip my husband and I took. I think we were just engaged at the time, so it was probably 2018 maybe-ish. We went down to Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is wine country in Oregon, not far from Seattle. His parents actually lived in Portland at the time, so we dropped our dog off there and then drove an extra like hour and a half to get to here. And it was just like a birthday trip. We didn't specifically choose wine because any of us were like really into wine. It was just kind of like, this looks really cool and wine is good. It's like the only alcoholic beverage I drink. And then we got there and first I was like, they all serve Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. How are we going to drink that much Pinot Noir? Like, how is it? And then like one place had like soils and like different types of soils in like these glass vases. And I'm like,
okay, wow.
Interesting. But I remember at one of the places trying one of the wines and it was a Chardonnay. And I just kept asking him, like, are you sure you did not put like pineapple or coconut in this wine? Because it smells and tastes just like pineapple and coconut. They're like, no, it's like what wine does. It's so cool. And before then, I'd really only had kind of like lower cost, not super, high value wine, you would say. So like I didn't get quite as much of these flavors. And so tried that wine, got really into it, and then we ended up doing a tour. We were the only two people on the tour because you had to book the tour over the phone, and we all know nobody likes to do things over the phone anymore. So we got to do this tour. The tour guide noticed that I was really into wine, recommended a book called Cork Dork. I got back from that trip, checked out that book from the library, and I just fell in love with this world of cool flavors and different parts of the world and history and science. And it was a never-ending world that I could learn about. And I was enthralled by it. So I checked out every book at the library that I could, started a wine club with friends so I could start tasting wine as often as possible without having to buy all the bottles. And then, just kind of like, yeah, right. And it just kind of like grew from there.
Very, very cool. I love that. I love wine, but I am not an expert in it in any way. But I do think in my next life, that's what I'll be a winemaker. I think that's going to be my next life. Working in the dog industry, one of the two.
I've definitely made you can go back on my Instagram and find one of those things where it's like the joke was like, all right, in sharks, this is what I want you to invest in and what I suggested. I'm like, if money was no thing, I would start a wine bar / dog play park.
Yes.
Like, my dog already goes to one of these for doggy daycare. She's totally spoiled. But it's just like a regular bar. But I'm like, imagine if it was like a cool wine bar and then your dogs could come and play. And then I could just hang out and talk to people about wine and pet dogs all day. Yeah. Kind of sounds like the dream.
It does. I think you should do it.
I did have a lot of people be like, yeah, I'd come. I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah. We'll put that on the retirement, the retirement plan someday.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that. That's really cool. So I love how this interest in wine really became this whole brand that you now do, right? You have the podcast, you have virtual tasting clubs, I know in the past you've done like in-person tours because you're here in Seattle. So like going to Soto or going to Woodinville. There's a lot of wine here. And I think that's really cool that all of these interests of yours have really come together and created this brand, Cork Fizz. So I'm curious, what stood out to you when you were starting the podcast? And I know there's like, you come to wine from a very approachable place, but there are very like snooty wine podcasts out there. So how'd you decide what your target market was as well?
I mean, a lot of it came from like how I'd already been talking about wine, right? So I started Cork Fizz in 2020 and I started the podcast in 2023. So I already had 3 years under my belt of being Cork Fizz and like learning how to talk about wine. And one of the things I always wanted to do was meet people where they were at. Right. And this is something that isn't just true with wine. I think one of the reasons I love and like I think Cork Fizz has become my thing is it's wine, but it's also like education and experience and community. And so I didn't want, the podcast to just be for experts, for people who are like me. Like that's great. There are already podcasts out there for people like me. I could list them off right now and they are amazing. but they're made for somebody who's like diving deep into the world of wine and really wants to dig into some of these things, right? And like spends their free time reading wine books. So like I knew there was this other area out there of people who just like were fascinated by wine and curious, but maybe just wanted something kind of casual to listen to, something very approachable, and something where like when they're listening and someone says something, the person who's interviewing, aka me, would then ask the question of like, okay, you just said this, what does that mean? You know, like go from a point of just like imagining that this person listening doesn't know much at all about wine, but they're curious because it's such a unique area. And you know, and that's what I do with teaching, and that's what I wanted to do with the podcast, is imagine somebody just coming in, they enjoy drinking wine, because that's what most people say to me, you know, when they're like, oh, I like drinking wine, but like you just said it, but I'm not an expert. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, but even experts don't know everything about wine. Like it's impossible. Yeah. But that's the thing, most people be like, oh, I like drinking wine, but I'm not an expert. I'm like, great, this podcast is for you. I just want this to be like a way for you to learn some fun new things, but from the level that you're at.
Oh my gosh, I love that. When I was in college, I went to school in Las Vegas at UNLV, and they had a food and beverage. They had like a big hospitality school there, right? It's Las Vegas. And so there were classes that you could take that were like cocktail classes or like wine classes. And I wish I took one. I had friends that did it, and the class was like the last class of the day, and they always left drunk. And I was like, you're getting credits for this? Why am I not doing? So, you know, I wasn't that sophisticated in college, I guess.
It is a nice subject to nothing like learning about wine and getting to have a glass of wine at the same time while you're learning.
Definitely. No, I wish I did, but you know, that's what I can just do now with my life, I guess.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
wine tasting in Woodinville. So, you know, you said you started this in 2020, but you didn't start the podcast till 2023. What was it that really made you realize, okay, a podcast is the next step I'm taking to build the Cork and Fizz brand?
I think the biggest thing was I wanted to have a long form content to share with people. And to me, the options that were standing in front of me, so basically like long form as in like something that could reach people and go into more depth and go into more detail. Because at the moment I was mainly just doing Instagram, a little bit of Pinterest, a little bit of TikTok, but they were just like small little reels. And I thought about, okay, the three options I'm kind of thinking of long form would be blog posts. And I did that for a little bit. Writing is not my thing though. I just when you tell me to sit down and write this thing, I'm just like, oh, that sounds terrible. And so I didn't want to do that. And I tried and I was just not good at it. And then the next thing was like YouTube videos, right? You could get on YouTube and start doing videos, and like, oh my God, if podcasts sounded overwhelming, that sounded even more like I had to do like video and editing and all of this, and like there's so much saturation already on YouTube. And so then the other option in front of me was podcasts. And to me, that felt like the right avenue to go down because I can talk. We've already learned that. And I'm good at interviewing people. I'm good at asking questions. And the biggest thing I just needed was somebody to help with the editing. So that's why I ended up going down that route.
Yeah, I love that. It is kind of like a easy, I mean, there's so many ways to repurpose podcasts now, especially with the rise of video podcasting. So that's really how I help my clients, is like showing up in more places with just recording for an hour or so. So I love that you saw the value in that, and that was the path you decided to go down. And totally YouTube, I've thought about starting my YouTube channel about 100 times, but that's so different than podcast editing. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe one day.
Well, and because like I think a lot of people who listen to podcasts are fine with just listening to me talk, right? Yeah. But I think if you were to make it into a YouTube video, like it's got to be snappy.
It does.
You know, versus like when I'm listening to a podcast, like I want it to sound conversational. I want it to sound casual, like you're just chatting with me. Yeah. So I feel like the pressure is a little lower.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because that really goes into knowing your audience and planning out the episodes. So what are some ways that you make learning about wine fun for your audience? And how do you plan those eps?
Good question. I mean, one way is like who I choose for interviews. I try to do a mix of like, some like cool big wine names that are fun for me, but then I think about what other people would like to listen to, right? And so like, at one point I had Bianca Bosker, who is the author of Cork Dork, the book that got me into wine, which was like
full
so
circle.
Fascinating. Yeah, it was amazing to me. And I think a lot of other people liked listening to that because I was so enthralled, by the interview. But I've also had people, on like, I think talking to different winemakers around the world and asking the questions that I think somebody who's new to wine would want to ask these people, and I said it before too, like when I'm in these interviews and one of the, the experts that I'm interviewing says something that I realize I might not have known when I first got into wine, I ask them about it, like they might be like, oh yeah, during fermentation, this and this happens. And I'm like, oh, okay. What is fermentation? How does that process work? Like I kind of dig in and act as if like I am the audience when I'm interviewing. And then for my solo episodes, I try to do 2 solo episodes and 1 interview and then kind of keep rotating through that. And I just kind of pay attention to what people want to learn about. I try different little mini series, like learning about different grape types, learning about different areas of the world. I can definitely tell every year people want to learn about non-alcoholic wines. So there's going to be, one of those every year where I update it and actually try wines and share my 2 cents. And then, a unique thing for me is I love asking why. So if I'm going to do an episode like on non-alcoholic wines, I'm also going to dig into like why and how. Like how in the world are non-alcoholic wines made? Like that's a question that I have. And so I kind of like assume other folks will have that question as well.
Yes. I went to a Friendsgiving and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to want to drink a glass of wine. So let me go and find non-alcoholic wine. So I went to Met Market, found this brand called Joyous. They're like a Seattle women-owned brand. $30 a bottle, which I don't think I've ever paid that much for alcohol wine. And so, but I brought it and my friends were like, what is it, grape juice? And I was like, that's a good question. It might just be grape juice, but it tasted like wine, so I don't know. So I'd love to hear.
Yeah, well, and it's crazy because like that's the thing. Like non-alcoholic wine is actually more expensive, despite what you'd think, because it has to go through another process. They make wine first, then they de-alcoholize it, and like just that fact of the matter, I think is fascinating, and I think my audience also thinks is fascinating, which is why they, they listen.
Yeah, no, there's so much fun topics around wine, and there's so many different ways that you can take it. So when you are planning out your episodes, like you said, you're listening to what your audience is curious about, such as non-alcoholic wine. But also with these series, like how do you approach those topics? Like I know you just were in France, and so you did like a French wine type of episode and series of like different types of wine from different countries. I don't know. Tell us more about how the planning goes.
Gosh, I mean, the planning is very much just like kind of like throw things at it. I tend to plan podcasts, about like maybe I try to do a full quarter, but I might not always get there. I do 1 podcast every week. So a quarter would be like about 12 podcasts. So I kind of think about, I look at the calendar, and so I'm kind of thinking about when things are going to come out. Based on that, and what do I have going on, right? So that French wine mini series, that made sense because I was going to France. So, I knew I'd want to talk about, and I knew I wanted to share my experience in France somehow. And I ended up realizing that the podcast would be the easiest way to do that. Because again, I just get to talk about the experience, and that's a lot easier than trying to create all of this more, which is funny because it's like the content on social media and stuff like that isn't necessarily need to be polished, but it needs to be so specific in a way that gets people's attention versus the podcast I could just talk.
Yeah.
So again, like I kind of was like, I look at what's going on, and then like in the new year, I know around January, people are going to want to know about non-alcoholic wines. If it's summertime, I know we're going to want like porch pounders or like easy drinking wines, or like what are chillable reds, I also end up looking up on like, what is it called? Like answer the public, something like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where you can like see what people are searching about the wine world right now, and so I'll grab some of that stuff. And then I think about the different series. So like some different series I do are like on the different grapes. because there's 10,000 different grapes, so I could continue that series forever.
What?
Yeah.
Crazy.
Isn't it wild? And then I think about different countries, so I've been doing that, like different little hidden gems. And then, of course, there's the interviews. And so that's just like, what do I think people would want? Who do I know in the wine world that I could reach out to? What do I think people would be interested in learning about? Send those emails out, throw, little placeholders in for the interviews, and then start kind of like batching out what I think the other like little solo episodes based again on like the calendar, what's interesting at the moment, the different mini series I was thinking about, maybe what I'm doing too, like what other areas of my business. So my Cork crew, I do a virtual tasting every month. Why not take advantage of like doing one of the virtual tastings and then take some of that information and put it in the podcast,
Yes.
So I don't have to do double the work.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a good idea. And what I love about your podcast too is you're taking such like a fun topic, but like you're building a business out of this. And so the podcast is helping you gain that thought leadership with your audience. And so you're also building a community alongside this through your virtual tastings. And I know that you sell tasting kits and all of those fun things. So really, can you tell us about the community aspect and what you've seen? I feel like the wine community is just so fun.
It really is. And that was definitely a huge plus of the podcast as well. Like people, when they are listening to these podcasts, my voice is in their ear. Like I think it's a very intimate form of communicating with people, and it helps, like you said, grow that trust and grow that thought leadership. And so when they think wine, they think Hailey, right? They think Cork and Fizz. So I think that's been a lot, and I've been surprised. It's really fun. Like, with podcasts, the hardest thing about it is that like it's a very like I record it and then I send it out, and then there's not a lot of interaction. That's probably the hardest thing for me versus like social media. I'm talking to people in the DMs on their stories all the time because I just like interacting with people. But the podcast, I think, has just helped me grow a deeper connection with so many people that I didn't even realize were listening to me. Like you just told me about somebody who's starting their own wine and travel podcast, and they started binging the podcast and they loved it. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool, but I have no idea. So I'm just like slowly growing this community of folks that I didn't even realize were listening. And then you have like my Cork crew listeners who like tell me all the time, like, oh, I listened to your last podcast and loved when you talked about this. And it's just, like I said, I think it's a way to just like deeper that connection, and people feel like they know me a lot more because they're actually hearing my voice in their ear while I'm talking on the podcast.
What I also love about the community that you're building is you're using this very strategically with your business, like we were talking about, because they can listen to the podcast, hear you being the expert on your show, and then ultimately go and buy a virtual wine tasting or join your wine club. Like there's a clear through line of like the podcast is like the lead capture, which leads to people being able to work with you. And that is 100% what I say every podcaster should do. So props to you. Can you talk more about how you really get people from listener to buyer or to client or to a club member?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely something I'm still working on. And I do work with a podcast manager. So she helps a lot with different ideas and things like that. Because it's a different world for me, right? I'm definitely somebody who's like work with the experts, in the different areas when you can. And so like one way we do is just like the easiest thing ever, which is like when you're listening to the podcast, I'll jump in and say, hey, you want to download my free, wine tasting guide? Go join my mailing list, or something like, if you're not on my mailing list yet, what are you waiting for? Like something so simple, but then it gets me their contact information and another way for me to contact them, which is through email. I also always highlight, come follow me on Instagram, ask me questions, encouraging a way for them to reach out and like just join more areas, even just like free areas of coming in contact with me, you know? And then from there, I also, you know, I sponsor my own podcast technically.
Yep.
So I'm definitely not at a point of like having sponsors yet. So I sponsor it myself. So like my Cork crew, my virtual tasting club sponsors the podcast. So I always do a little, you know, little mini ad on the Cork crew and encourage folks to come try it out. Because again, like you said, it's very much like a natural thing to like want to listen to me talk about wine and then be like, oh, well, I could do that live with like other people. And like when I'm listening to this interview, oh, I could actually ask this person questions. Like I'm trying, you know, I feel like it's like a very natural flow into that. And so I highlight it at least 2 or 3 times, usually on a podcast, just to remind folks is like, this is an opportunity you can do as well, and kind of bring them in. And then a few times, like depending on the subject, I'll highlight other things, you know, like I've got a holiday gift guide episode coming out. Well, it goes with my holiday gift guide. So obviously I'm going to highlight that and encourage them, you know, to click on that. But it's definitely, yeah, it's like get them in contact with more things Cork and Fizz. And then like, yeah, the free sponsorship that I do or the self-sponsorship.
Yeah, honestly, I think that all businesses should sponsor their own podcasts unless you're like, I don't know, I don't know. Honestly, I truly feel like every business, since our services are going to pay us more than what a sponsor can. There's such a big misconception about sponsorships and podcasts, I think, because we look at people with huge podcasts and we're like, oh, they're making so much money. But that's just because they have so many listeners, where in reality, like most sponsors will pay like $25 per 1,000 downloads of your podcast. And so let's say you get 2,000 downloads, that's $50. And most podcasts don't get 1,000 downloads until they're like years in, right? And so I can stand on a what is it, the saying? I don't know. I really
the soapbox.
Yep.
Yeah, your soapbox.
I have strong feelings about this, but I honestly think, you know, same with me. I sponsor this podcast. I sponsor my other podcast, and it just, I think it works best for business this way. So love that. I definitely love that. Cool. Well, are there any other tips you want to share with podcasters before we get into the rapid fire section, or any tips about wine or anything like that?
Oh gosh, we could go forever about wine. Okay, I'll give one tip on both that I think will be kind of at least simple or kind of like a good place to start. So I think for the podcast, starting there, the biggest tip I would give is don't strive for perfection when you're starting. Mm-hmm. I think when I first thought of starting the podcast, I thought I needed a podcast studio. I needed the right camera. I needed the right microphone. I needed, you know, everything to be perfect. And then I could start, you know, versus like what I did. I mean, I did work with a manager. I think that's obviously another big pinpoint is like working with somebody who knows what they're doing. She kind of led me into like, here's how to, you know, launch your podcast. Here's what I think you should do to prep ahead of time. But I think it's like starting imperfect, right? Like, you know, imperfect action, like just start doing something and don't worry about it's perfect. Like everybody's like, oh, just like record in like a walk-in closet in your house. And I'm like, I'm sorry, who has walk-in closets right now? Like
we're in Seattle. They don't have that here.
Yeah. Like that does not exist. And they're like, choose a room without very many hard surfaces. And I'm like, dude, the only spot I can do this is my office. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been doing. And it's totally fine. Yeah. Like the software is so good. Like you really don't hear that much. So I'd say like imperfect action with the podcast and just stick to it. I think I still wish I had more downloads and more things, but I have to remind myself that like, you know, when my podcast has like, when an episode has 100 downloads, that's 100 people who found your podcast and wanted to listen to it. And it has to start somewhere. Yeah. And if you keep putting things out, keep trying new things, you know, it's going to happen. It just takes time.
Yes.
So I'd say the imperfect action. And then for wine, I think it's similar, but just like being willing to try new things. I think a lot of people treat wine like they're afraid that they won't like something new, which when I make the comparison with food always sounds silly. It's like, imagine if you only ever ate chicken nuggets because you're like, I like chicken nuggets and I know they're good, so I'm gonna always order chicken nuggets. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you are missing out on so much good food. And like, chances are, like, if you end up deciding to do a chicken sandwich instead, you're probably gonna like it. Yeah. And it's the same way with wine. Like, it's very seldom that you're going to get a wine and you're like, oh God, this is so great. Like, that's not going to happen that much.
Yeah.
And so like,
that's how I feel with beer.
Yeah. That's fair. I still haven't gotten into the beer world, but that's like all beers. It's not just like I like one and I don't like others.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, what is this? That's how that like reaction is how I feel about beer.
Yes, but like I think in wine, and it's okay to like what you like. Like I'm not saying that like you have to like other things. I'm saying if you want to learn more about wine and, you know, discover new wines that you like, you're gonna have to try some new ones, you know, and good ways to do that. You can start a wine club with friends. That's one thing I did where like I only had to buy a bottle, but I got to try like 10 different bottles of wine. Going to wine tastings at local wine shops, like you said, going to the tasting rooms if there's any in your area, just like getting your hands on trying as much wine as you can and start jotting down what you like about it. That's like the biggest thing is my goal when you come to Cork and Fizz for pretty much anything. I want you to discover what you like in wine. I don't want to tell you what to like because I couldn't. It's impossible. But I want to help you discover what you like and what you enjoy drinking. And if I can do that, I've succeeded. So your first step is just start trying a bunch of wine.
I love that. That's a great and fun first step. Thanks so much for sharing those tips. I am excited to get into this rapid fire section with you. So I have 8 questions. And the first one is, what's the first podcast you ever listened to?
I couldn't tell you for 100% sure, but the first one that stuck out to me was Wine for Normal People. I'm definitely thinking it was probably wine related. It was either wine or business related was the first podcast I listened to. And Wine for Normal People, another great wine podcast that is super fun.
Awesome. I love that. I love the name of it too.
Yeah, it definitely fits in my category as well. It's like avoiding the snobbery.
Yeah. Okay, so besides your own podcast genre, what's your favorite podcast genre to listen to?
I probably mostly listen to like business and marketing podcasts other than wine. I think it's such a great area to learn new skills for free, right? So
yes, me too. I love business. I mean, that is my genre, but I could listen to business podcasts all day.
Right.
Do you have any dream podcast guests?
I mean, yes. I think when I'm trying to think of like what comes to mind, I would just love to get more winemakers from around the world. That's one of the hardest things, right? I can connect with a lot of Washington winemakers because I know them around here, but finding winemakers around the world to talk to, also because there's usually a language barrier, right? So they need to speak English. But a specific person, I think Madeline Puckett would be super fun. She is actually from the Seattle-ish area. I think she's from Woodinville. But she wrote Wine Folly, which is a very, very famous wine book and has like the whole Wine Folly website. And like, she's definitely been an inspiration to me. And like, she does a lot of like education on wine. And again, making it approachable, making it fun. So I think it'd be fun to like chat with her and be like, learn about how she created this empire around learning about wine.
Oh, that's so cool. That's amazing. Awesome. What is one podcast you recommend everyone listen to?
So this is going to go a little outside of all of the like genres we've talked about so far. But I really love, have you ever heard of Brené Brown?
Yes.
She's an amazing author, amazing motivational speaker, and she's known for like vulnerability. And she's somebody, I read one of her books in college and it really opened up something in me where it was like basically this idea of like, you know, people can, I think it was like a quote from Teddy Roosevelt where it was like, you know, when you're down in the arena, like the people in the stands can like, you know, make fun of you and say things, but it really means nothing unless they're down in the arena with you. Like you are trying things, you are doing shit, like that stuff matters more than what everybody else who's afraid to do anything could say to you. And I think that just like really stuck with me, and her idea of like, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say when you're struggling. It's okay to be honest. And I wear my heart on my sleeve. It's very hard for me to hide anything that I'm feeling. So that really meant a lot to me. So she has 2 podcasts. And I know one of them is called Unlocking Us. I can't remember what the other one is called, but both of her podcasts are just, I think they really hit the soul.
I love that. I love Brené Brown. That's awesome. My next question is, what is your favorite podcast listening platform?
You know what's funny? I actually jump between them. Isn't
Yeah,
that weird?
really?
I feel like so many people listen to like one single one. I've got Apple Podcasts and Spotify podcasts that I use both of them. I don't have a subscription with Spotify. I was a Google Music girl. I work for Google during my day job. And so I ended up getting like music through them, and they used to have a podcast thing, but I don't think they do anymore.
They closed it.
So now I just like I just kind of listen to it'll either be Spotify or Apple, whatever I'm feeling at the moment, and I have no rhyme or reason for choosing.
So funny. I love that.
One.
I love that. You're the first person with that answer, so thank you.
I know. I don't know why.
Just, whatever vibes you're going for. That's
yeah. It's just like I listen to this podcast on here, but then I listen to this podcast like, for no reason at all. They both exist on both platforms.
I love it. I love that. Oh my gosh, that's like my dog. He has mood swings, and I don't know why. And I'm like, it has to be like the time of day and the way the wind is blowing, and like the vibes, or like what side of the bed he woke up on. I feel like that's similar.
Yep, very similar.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Okay, as a podcast listener, do you have any pet peeves?
Ooh. I don't think so. I mean, I don't like short podcast episodes that are like half full of ads.
Yeah.
Like, when I turn on a podcast, like, I don't mind you promoting your own stuff, and I don't, I think that's, no matter where you put it, whether it's the beginning, middle, or end, I think that's great. But if it's like a 14-minute episode, like we're 8 minutes in and you're like still talking about your thing, I'm like, okay, that's great, but like, why am I here? Other than that, I don't think so. I mean, sometimes I'll get bored if it's just a lot of talk and it's just like a lot of filler. Those aren't really my type of episodes, but I don't think that's a pet peeve. I think that's just like not my go-to.
Yeah, I love that. Awesome. 2 more questions. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received around podcasting?
I think be consistent. I think that's like the one thing I've stuck to, and like, stick to it every week. I've been doing it every week for over a year now, and it's been really cool, like what I can create. And then I guess like to go with that, in order to do it every week, you gotta batch create the episodes and like plan ahead of time. Like there's only been a few times where I've been like, oh crap, I really gotta get this episode in, versus like I usually try to record at least a month in advance, if not more.
Yeah, and definitely working with an editor or producer helps with that a ton, for sure.
Yes, because I have to get it to her in time so that she can get it edited and get it out.
Absolutely. I love that advice. Okay, and then last question, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
I think it's maybe a little bit about the interviewing. Like, I think I was somewhat confident that I was good at asking questions and coming up with questions. But I think you can tell when somebody's good at interviewing and when they're not on a podcast. And that has been some really good feedback that I've gotten, where people are like, I like how you ask people questions. I like how you get involved in the conversation, but also let them tell their stories. And it keeps it interesting. So I think, it's been like a nice surprise and a good pat on the back of like, I am good at talking to all different kinds of people. And even when I get a little intimidated, when somebody's coming on the show, it still comes across well in the podcast. Oh my gosh. Well, Hailey, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. Where can people come and find you? Yeah, well, obviously, if you're listening to a podcast, you like podcasts, so come check out my podcast. It's called The Cork Fizz Guide to Wine. Otherwise, you can find me on Instagram at Cork Fizz. I also have a website that talks about all my different services I offer. Also usually has a freebie with a pop-up somewhere. You can join the mailing list at the bottom, and that gives you a free 15 wines under $15. You're going to get a free something if you sign up your email pretty much anywhere in my world, but that's corkandfizz.com. So basically, just search Cork and Fizz, and you will find me somewhere. Awesome. Well, I'll put all of those links in the show notes, but thank you again so much. I hope that all the wine lovers come and listen to your show, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.